Good evening, or good afternoon, I should say. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Professor Matthew App's inaugural lecture. And welcome also those joining us online. For those who don't know, my name is William Bloss. I'm Head of College for Life and Environmental Sciences. And it's my great pleasure to say a few words to kick off this evening's celebrations. My first task really is to extend that welcome to Matt's colleagues and collaborators and friends who are joining us in person and online. A welcome, of course, to his wife, Pat, mother Kate, stepfather Alan, father Colin, partner Susan, as well as his brother Daniel, who are all here today. Matt obtained an undergraduate degree in psychology from Royal Holloway at the University of London, and then a master's in research methods in psychology from Reading. He returned to Royal Holloway for a PhD in cognitive neuroscience under the supervision of Professor Narendra Ramnani, who is here with us today. Then after a postdoc supervised by Professor Manos Sakiris, he moved to the University of Oxford to work with Professor Masood Hussain, who is also here today. As an aside, it's great to see a career where people are keen to follow you through and celebrate with you. So that's nice to see. In 2015, he was awarded a prestigious BBSRC Future Leaders Fellowship, and 3 years later, a BBSRC David Phillips Fellowship to start his own research group in Oxford. In 2020, he realized Birmingham was a much better place to be, naturally, and moved his motivation and social neuroscience lab here to the Centre for Human Brain Health in the School of Psychology, working closely also with the IMH. He tells me he loves it here, is delighted to have such kind and collaborative colleagues, and to work in such an intellectually stimulating environment, and hopes to continue contributing to the ever-growing success of these centres. Matt is really passionate about understanding how the brain works, about what underlies motivation. He takes a multidisciplinary approach using computational approaches alongside every human neuroscience trick he can get his hands on, which makes CHBH the perfect place to be to tackle this problem. Much of his work is basic neuroscience, but its influence spans much more widely. His paradigms and models are being taught in summer schools and used by other labs in every continent. And as a result, his impact is felt on fields across psychology, neurological and psychiatric research, and impacting on the social and health sciences. His work has won multiple national and international awards, including from the Society for Social Neuroscience, the European Society for Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, and the British Association for Cognitive Neuroscience. More importantly, Matt is also passionate about cats. He sets himself a goal to cycle 3,000 kilometers a year, which he says he usually meets, he claims. He enjoys a glass or two of whiskey, and he became a cat dad in 2018, an uncle to his two nephews, Alexander and Nathaniel, last year, and of course he'll become a human dad relatively soon. This evening, Matt is going to tell us all the reasons he has found for why you can't be bothered. So please join me in congratulating him on his inaugural lecture. Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's an unbelievable privilege and pleasure to give this lecture in front of so many of my friends and family and such wonderful colleagues here in Birmingham. Today, I'm here to talk to you about effort and why you can't be bothered. And usually when people start these kind of lectures, they say, like, we're smart, we're intellectuals. Let's look at what philosophers have to say about this. So let's go back in time and look at how important this problem has been for many, many years. And so I thought I'd get 2 quotes up from some very influential writers and philosophers. The first is Albert Camus, who suggested that without work or effort, all life goes rotten. And another quote that I wanted to introduce you to was that from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss philosopher in the 1700s, who said, "Too much effort to increase our happiness transforms it into misery." And there's 2 things that I think this really highlights. One is this fundamental tension that I'm so passionate about, which is, why do we put in effort? When do we put in effort? How much should we put in? And how difficult a decision that is. And the other thing we can learn about it is that philosophers are really miserable about it. There's this fundamental tension, this tightrope you have to be on of how much effort to put in, or otherwise it's rotten or it's misery. So that's great. Well, it's wonderful, inspirational stuff from the past. I thought maybe we can be more modern. Universities, society is going through a revolution through artificial intelligence. So what I wanted to do was to look to the future and say, let's ask AI what it thinks about this topic. And in particular, I asked ChatGPT if it could summarize my research in 1 word and 1 meme. And this is what I got. Meh. For the older people in the room, meh is a sort of millennial generated word, which means a lack of interest or enthusiasm. Now, fortunately, ChatGPT qualified that it wasn't talking about my personality as much as the likeness of that picture is. It did say that, that my research is the next time you're feeling meh, it's exactly the kind of mental state that my research is trying to decode. Why you just don't have enthusiasm for engaging in behaviors. So, lacking enthusiasm, misery, rottenness, wonderful. Welcome to my inaugural lecture. It is going to be the opposite of an inspirational Instagram quote. It is going to tell you all the reasons why you can't be bothered. It's going to be what I would like to call an inaugural dirge. We're going to talk about all the reasons why your brain doesn't want to put in effort into things. Okay, I'm not quite going to do that. I actually would like this to be a little bit more inspirational than ChatGPT might have you think, and actually try and tell you that there's real beauty and something fascinating about trying to understand that feeling of a lack of enthusiasm for doing something. That by looking at the brain anatomy and the cells that are responsible for motivating our behaviors, there's real beauty and something really fascinating and exciting about it. And that when we combine this with trying to understand what chemicals in our brains are responsible for motivating us, and with doing that alongside uncovering the fundamental equations that govern how we decide whether to put in effort or not, we really might understand something much more about the human condition. And I really do think this is a really important topic that's perhaps been somewhat underappreciated by the sciences in the past. If you think about your average day, you make hundreds of decisions about whether to put in effort or not. Do you take the stairs or the lift? Do you drive or do you walk? And it's not always about making some time saving. It's actually about that effort. And if you don't put in effort, if you choose the easy way out lots and lots of times, it's going to add up. You're going to be less active. And we know that symptoms or syndromes that can impact on motivation are linked to unemployment. They're linked to poorer educational outcomes in young people, and they're linked to physical and mental health. So even for otherwise typically healthy people, we need to get a better understanding of what motivates us. And in a more severe form, those syndromes can really impact in a big way. So apathy and anhedonia, for example, are 2 syndromes that have huge impacts on people's daily lives. And they are so common in neurological and psychiatric conditions. I'm going to steal some data from Masood Hussain, my longtime collaborator here, showing that across all of these different neuropsychiatric conditions, from between 36% of stroke patients and up to 72% of patients with frontotemporal dementia will be diagnosed with a severe form of apathy. That means they are just not engaging in goal-directed behavior in day-to-day lives. And so that is why from a scientific perspective and from a societal perspective, I think that understanding motivation is really important. But today is not about why I would try and justify to a funder about why this is an important topic. Today is all about me. And so today I want to take a different approach from my normal talks to talk about 8 lessons I've learned about effort. And what I'm going to do is take you through moments in my life, moments with particular people and images that really depict different lessons we can learn about motivation and effort, things that have inspired my research or things that are perfectly illustrative of some aspect of motivation. So these are my 8 lessons that hopefully is a bit better than a dirge. Okay, so lesson number 1. Effort is a cost that we avoid. So this is a picture of me when I'm about 9 or 10 years old. And there's 3 things that I think this picture illustrates. One is the ravaging effects of the last 30 years on my appearance. The second is that is a genuine Casio calculator watch, which tells you just how cool I was and how many friends I had at school. But the third thing is about what happened at this period of my life and how illustrative it is about motivation. So it was when I was about this old that my parents were actually called into the primary school to discuss whether I should be put forward to do the 11+ exams in order to go to grammar school. And I distinctly remember that my parents were told that they didn't really think it was necessarily worth putting me through the stress of doing the exams because the teacher wasn't really sure that I was actually going to pass this. And what I think the teacher and possibly my parents didn't know is that I was a very motivated child to play football, but I really didn't put any effort into schoolwork. And the reason at that point in my life that I therefore wasn't doing very well at school was not because I didn't really have the capacity, it's just I couldn't be bothered. I just thought football was way more interesting and I put way more effort into that than I would into working hard at school. Now, the nice thing was that that teacher not believing in me really fired me up. And so I actually did work hard and I did pass the 11+ and I went to the grammar school. And that's where I learned how to put effort into all the wrong things. So that's where I learned how to play table football really well. I learned to drink, I learned to drink, I learned to drink, I learned to dance. But I made some really, really good friends along the way that I'm still really good friends with today, including Adam Mahart, who's here with us, who probably didn't realize when he wore that Hawaiian shirt that it would be ending up in an inaugural lecture. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. The point was that effort is a cost that we avoid unless we think it has value. Unless there's some incentive that really motivates us to put in that effort, we won't do it. And that's been sort of a guiding principle of lots of work on motivation and in my work in motivation in neuroscience and psychology over the last few years. And so what we've been trying to do is to try and capture that feeling that effort is a cost and see whether it really is something that impacts on people's decisions. So what we do in our experiments is we bring people into the lab and we get them to make lots and lots of decisions about whether they're willing to put in a certain amount of effort in order to obtain a certain amount of reward. And what this means is that we vary the amount of points that they get for each decision. More points also equates to a larger bonus for payment for taking part in the experiment. So these are real financial decisions. If they work hard, they will actually earn more money for taking part in our experiments. We also vary the amount of effort that's going to be required in order to obtain that reward. And we do this in some experiments, usually where we use these grip force devices. So we give them these, they squeeze them as hard as they can, and then we set different percentages below that as their different levels of difficulty or different levels of effort that they'll have to exert in order to obtain those points. And so we can vary the effort and we can vary the reward. So we can ask, well, how much reward do people need in order to put in a particular level of effort? And so we've done that with physical effort. We can also do it with mental effort. So we can give people cognitively demanding tasks, switching of attention, mathematical puzzles. It doesn't really seem to matter. The story is always the same. People don't like more difficult versions of tasks. They don't like exerting the effort. And so in this data, you can see that for both a cognitive task and a physically effort task, they're less likely to accept to exert that effort for that reward as the level of difficulty goes up. And you can also see that, of course, people like rewards, so the points also have an effect. So as the amount of points they're going to get goes up, the amount of credits, the more likely they are to accept an offer. So that tells us that people avoid effort unless they can get more reward. But perhaps the thing that I think is most useful in this research that we've been doing is the using computational models to better understand what's actually going on in people's heads when they make these decisions. So what we try and do is try and identify a set of equations that can best explain the decisions that people make in these tasks. So what that means from a sort of illustrative point of view is we assume in people's heads that when they see some reward and they see how hard they're going to have to work for it, they compute some kind of value. They ascribe some value to that. And things of more value, you're more likely to do. Things of less value, you're less likely to do. So you might find then a motivated person, if you said you can give them £2, and along the bottom of this graph is different levels of difficulty. So on the right-hand side is when they have to squeeze really hard. On the left is when it's really, really easy. You can see a motivated person might say, well, for these low and moderate efforts, I'll do it for £2, but after that, the value is just not worth it. I'm not going to choose it. A more apathetic person might say, well, you know what, £2 is almost never worth it. I wouldn't even pick up £2 if I saw it on the floor. And when you might think then if we increase the amount of money, that's going to make people more motivated, and that's what we assume in these models. So if we give you £10, it's almost always worth it. You'll always exert all levels of effort if it's for £10 if you're a motivated person. But the more apathetic person might say, well, you know what, actually, still the really high levels of effort are just not worth it for £10. So that's what our equations are trying to uncover. What is this computation that's going on in people's heads? And we use these kind of models that we call parabolic discounting models as one example, where in these equations it can quantify exactly the kind of numbers you can see there. And then that we use to estimate the decisions that people make in the task and explain how it is that people say sometimes effort for reward is worth it, but at another point it isn't. I won't go into all of the equations today because it's quite warm in here and I don't think anybody really wants to hear that. But what I will tell you is that these models can be really useful for a couple of things. So one is the fact that within these models, they have these parameters labeled there as the red K that we fit separately to each participant's behavior. And so this gives us a nice, precise quantification of how motivated different people are. When that K is higher, it's someone who's more apathetic, that thinks that these combinations of effort for reward are really not worth it more often. When it's lower, it's someone who thinks that effort doesn't devalue rewards very much. And we've shown in many, many studies that these kind of computational models can really nicely capture how people make effort-based decisions. And of course, what these models assume is that effort is a cost that discounts reward. The other nice thing these models can do is that they can be used alongside brain imaging, such as fMRI, to ask, well, where in the brain does activity vary every time someone's making a decision with the value according to this model? And so that's what Trevor Chong and I did when we were postdocs working with Masood Hussain. We looked for where in the brain might signal the value of exerting cognitive and physical effort for reward according to our computational models. And we actually found a whole brain network, but today I'm going to be mostly talking about the anterior cingulate cortex. And I'm talking about the anterior cingulate cortex because Andy did his inaugural lecture a few weeks ago, and he said that the thalamus was the most important brain area. But science is self-correcting, so I can now today tell you that the anterior cingulate cortex is actually the most important brain area. Yeah. He's going to kill me. So we found that a whole network of brain areas, but we particularly found this anterior cingulate cortex region in which activity varied with value according to our computational models. And so that tells us that this is a brain area that is really saying, well, rewards are worth it, but not really for high effort. And so this is a brain area that is responsible for making us think that effort is a cost and something that we should avoid unless we can get really high rewards. Okay, lesson 2. Helping others is hard work. So for this, I want to turn to something called softmax. So for many people, softmax is an equation that is actually foundational within artificial intelligence work. And it's also an equation that we use within our computational models. But for me, this is softmax. So softmax is my cat. And he can teach me many lessons about effort, mostly about how he almost never really wants to exert it. That first image is a lie. He's usually like this. But softmax is really clever because what he's realized is that sometimes he needs things from me, but sometimes I don't want to put in the effort. So every evening, about 9 o'clock, he gets hungry. He wants his dinner. And he sees me lying on the sofa. And he knows I'm not going to get up off that sofa to help him unless he gives me some kind of incentive. So what he does is lie on the floor in front of me, rolling around, looking as fluffy and cute as he can. And he does this because he knows as soon as he does that, I get excited, I go and try and stroke him, at which point he gets up, runs to his food bowl, looks at me, looks at the food bowl, expecting his dinner. And so what this tells us is that being helpful towards others is effortful. And so we need to know that there's some incentive in order to be willing to do it. And that is a series of work that Patricia Lockwood, my longtime collaborator, have been interested. Calm down, you know. She is a longtime collaborator. We have been really interested in. And so we did an experiment many years ago where what we wanted people to do was to make effort-based decisions, the same as they did in that other experiment I showed. And they would have to put in effort, physical effort, in order to obtain rewards. But the key thing was, on half the trials, was they would make the decision, they would put in the effort, and they knew that the points would increase their own bonus payment for taking part in the experiment. But on the other half of the trials, they would make the decision, they would put in the effort, but the rewards would be delivered to somebody else. In this experiment, it wasn't softmax, it was an anonymous other individual. And so the key thing with this experiment is we could look at how willing are people to put in effort for other people, and how willing are they to put in effort for other people relative to how motivated they are to work for themselves. And over many years of many students' projects, many postdocs, many PhD students have all tried to find the opposite of the effect that we always repeatedly find, which is that people are much nicer to themselves than they are to other people. People are more willing to put in effort to obtain rewards for themselves than they are to put in effort for other people. So while we do work for other people, we aren't that nice when it comes to effort. And Patricia and I have shown over the years in a number of studies that this appears to be linked to this anterior cingulate gyrus region that you can see here, where activity is scaled with how much effort it's going to be to help somebody else, and in which activity is actually scaled with how much force you're putting in, how much energy you're putting in actions that will benefit other people. But this region doesn't seem to respond when you're putting an effort to obtain rewards for yourself or anything related to your processing information about oneself, suggesting that it might be a region that's really actually involved in motivating you to be helpful and put in effort for others, but not related to other aspects of motivation. And more recently, a PhD student, Jamie Talbot, showed that actually if you boost dopamine levels, that this can actually increase how pro-social you are towards others relative to self. Okay, so we work less hard for others. Helping others is harder work. We treat effort as more of a cost when it's helping somebody else compared to when it's helping ourselves. And that seems to be linked to dopamine and to this anterior cingulate gyrus region. Okay, lesson 3. Sometimes exerting high effort is worth it. Now, I think, unfortunately, all of this was supposed to be related to my PhD supervisor, Narendra, who is stuck on a train somewhere near Stafford. And he's from London, so it's very far north for him. So this is Narendra. He isn't our Prime Minister. He is president of the British Neuroscience Association. And he was here, he was at Downing Street representing the Sindhi community that he's a major part of in London. And last year I watched him discuss a project he'd been doing looking at diversity issues in UKRI funding grant applications, where he was at a parliamentary select committee talking about this really important and influential work. And what this lesson teaches us is that sometimes exerting high effort is really worth it. And it also teaches another lesson, which is we can observe how motivated other people are. We look at the actions of other people, we can look at the payoffs that those other people get, and we can think about how motivated they are. And I'm so annoyed he's not here to me to actually for once say something nice about him. But I know how hard Narendra has worked, and I know that he's really earned this payoff. And to illustrate that point that we can easily process how motivated other people are, I wanted to use 2 images of cats, of course. So I want you to look at this image and you can immediately look at it and know that that is a motivated cat. That is a cat that is goal-directed, it's putting in a lot of effort, and it knows where it wants to go in life. There is this other cat, who you may be familiar with now, who is much less motivated, much less willing to put in effort. So you can easily just look at those images and immediately infer how motivated those two individuals are. And so this is something our brain is readily able to do. But actually, there wasn't much work back when I started this line of research that really talked about this. And so during my PhD with Narendra, we started a line of work trying to build up an understanding of what computations might go on in my brain that allow us to understand how motivated you are. And that led later down the line to some work with Matthew Rushworth and Steve Chang, where we put forward a whole computational framework of exactly how the brain might track how motivated other people are. And in some of my own research and many other studies from Steve Chang and others looking at single cells in macaque monkeys, we've repeatedly shown that there's this anterior cingulate gyrus region that you've already seen before that's involved in helping other people, actually also seems to be involved in tracking how motivated other people are. And crucially, this region doesn't respond to any feature of your own motivation. So this is really about processing the value that other people place on behaviors. So we can readily compute the motivation of other people, and it seems to be processed in this specialized area. And lastly, I want to say that actually we've gone on to show with collaborators such as Josh Bolsters that this brain area processes information differently in individuals with autism. So people with autism who struggle, particularly those who struggled with social deficits, showed disrupted computations in this particular brain area, suggesting that we really might need this brain area to process information in order to understand the motivation of other people. Okay. So lesson 5. So there has a rumor gone round that I like to buy bikes more than I like to actually ride them. And I'd like to show this image to dispel that particular myth. And I want to also point to this one particular individual. This is Ed Collinswood, who is not a psychologist or neuroscientist, but he's taught me a lot about motivation. So Ed was my housemate when I first moved to Oxford. He's a geologist. He knows nothing about the brain whatsoever. He does know a lot about rocks. But he is one of the most motivated people you will ever meet. When we were housemates together, he used to cycle 15 miles to work. Instead of having lunch, he'd do a 5K run. He'd then cycle home and excitedly say to me, "Do you want to go for a bike ride?" Where usually I'd be saying, "Well, I've spent all day sitting at the computer. I'm quite tired." But he got me really into cycling. And he's also killed me many times because he always insists that he's the one that plans our routes. But cycling with him has really taught me a lot of things about motivation. And one thing it's really taught me and inspired some of my research was just how dynamic fatigue is. When you're out cycling, exerting effort, going up a hill, you feel really tired when you reach the top. Then you spend a short period of time resting, and suddenly you're feeling less fatigued. And this impacts on our motivation as well. Once we get more tired, we're less motivated to carry on doing something, but we rest, we recover, and suddenly we're motivated again. And so all these bike rides taught me that fatigue is really something that happens constantly, fluctuating moment to moment. You can be fatigued at one moment and less fatigued at another. And so with my PhD student, Tanya Muller, we wanted to investigate exactly that. What are the equations that govern how our fatigue fluctuates from one moment to the next? And how does that impact upon our motivation? And we tested a range of different plausible models, and we came up with this particular one. There will be a quiz about this equation at the end. So I'm not going to go through the equation, but what it illustrates is that this fatigue is something that fluctuates every second that we're doing something. When we do something effortful, our fatigue rises. When we spend some time resting, it declines. But it also gradually increases all the time whilst we're doing demanding things. So if you're doing a demanding task for an extended period of time, you will always be more tired at the end. And we then combined that with our computational models looking at effort-based decision-making to say, well, actually, how does fatigue impact on motivation? And what we found is that what happens is as fatigue increases, it increases the costs. It increases how averse we are to effort. So as our level of fatigue rises, the value we ascribe to doing really effortful behaviors just gets lower and lower and lower. So what this means is as you become more exhausted, you're more likely to only want to do really easy, really highly rewarding behaviors. And Tanya did this with fMRI and showed that, yet again, the anterior cingulate cortex, the most important brain area, was signaling information about our levels of fatigue. So we found that different components of this model mapped onto these two subregions of the anterior cingulate cortex, telling us that this brain area is really signaling information about how tired you feel every time you're making a decision about whether to exert effort, and perhaps therefore is the region responsible for making effort seem more costly when you're more exhausted. And we've taken that work a little bit further over the years since to show that we can use the same approach to look at, rather than physical fatigue, like we've usually done, we can also look at mental fatigue. And interestingly, what we found with mental fatigue is that rather than the cost of the effort, it seems to be more errors that drive how fatigued you feel. When you make a mistake when you're doing a cognitive task, you're more likely to feel fatigued afterwards than when you perform something correctly. And Tanya also showed that this was linked to levels of dopamine. They might be linked to levels of dopamine. So she tested Parkinson's disease patients on and off their usual dopaminergic medication. And what was interesting was that at the start of the experiment, patients were similar in levels of fatigue, both on and off their medication. However, as the task went on, as time went on, they suddenly diverged in that patients off their medication felt more fatigued than patients on their medication. And through the computational modeling, we're able to show that this is because actually patients get less of a recovery when they're resting, when they're off medication compared to on. And lastly, my PhD student, Katia Dudzikowska, has showed that these models of fatigue might also be able to tell us things about confidence. So she showed through computational modeling that our levels of fatigue influence how confident we feel. And in particular, the more exhausted we get, the less confident we feel, even in tasks where you're still succeeding at it. So it seems like fatigue might have many deleterious effects on our motivation and our confidence. Okay, so time for an upbeat summary then. How are we doing on that inaugural dirge? Well, one is we've shown that effort is a cost that we avoid. The next we've shown is that fatigue makes it even worse. We've also shown that helping others is really effortful as well. So great. And what we've shown is that all of these processes seem to be linked to these different subregions within the anterior cingulate cortex. And we've also suggested that it might be linked to dopamine. Now, there is some hope because we can observe the high effort of others and we can process the benefits that they get. So there's some hope that not all of the things about effort are necessarily so rotten and miserable. We've also learned that cats are lazy, PhD supervisors are great, and Matt has questionable friends. So for the last few lessons, I want to move more towards the direction of research that actually my lab has been going in the last few years and will be doing more of in the future. And the next lesson really comes from a period of time when I started working with Manos Sakiris that you can see here. So he was my first postdoc supervisor. I learned many things from Manos, particularly about how to integrate ideas from philosophy and phenomenology into experimental psychological and neuroscience research. I also learned about the huge effects that deadlines can have on our willingness to exert effort. And I pass no blame on Manos with this before I go on to illustrate this point. But what happened was about 4 months out from the end of my PhD, Manos offered me a postdoc position in his group, which was fantastic, and I was extremely excited. However, he said, but you've got to start in 3 months, when I thought my PhD was finishing in 4 months. And what I hadn't done was listen to any of Narinda's advice or followed any of the advice that I now give everybody in my lab, which is write as you go. Make sure your chapters are finished well ahead of time because you don't want to be at the end really pressed for putting in effort. So 3 months out now from the end of my PhD, I just had 2 fMRI studies left to finish analyzing and 5 chapters to write. Easy. Except it wasn't. I had to put in so much effort. I had to exclude everything else that was going on and focus solely on putting in so much effort in order to complete my thesis before a deadline. And I was a broken person at the end of it, so strongly don't recommend it. But what this illustrated to me is something that I became really fascinated about, is this idea that deadlines can fundamentally change how we think about effort and how motivated we are. We're all familiar of the idea of people pulling an all-nighter. And that is a situation where suddenly you'll put in all your effort right before a deadline. And so when Andrea Pizarro joined my group as a postdoc, we got really interested in this idea about how people work and put in effort over slightly more extended periods of time to complete goals before deadlines. And so we observed that what might drive these decisions is two things. One, how much work have you completed? So have you finished lots of the task, or have you finished very little of it? And the second is how much time you've got left to complete it. Because when you're in this kind of situation where you've completed a lot of the task and you're well ahead of the deadline, there's not much pressure to put in loads of effort. You can kind of do things whenever you want, whenever it makes sense. However, if you have completed the same amount of the task, but you are minutes or hours away from that grant application deadline, suddenly effort is everything you have to put in. Effort is valuable. You need to put in lots of effort to make sure you complete the task in time. And so Andrea and I thought that computationally what this really can be thought of as deadline pressure. The amount of work you've got left to complete divided by how long you've got left to complete it is the amount of pressure that defines how much value putting in effort should be. So that means when you've got lots of work left to complete, there's more pressure. And when you've got little time left to complete it, there's more pressure. And so we put forward a hypothesis and a computational framework whereby rather than effort being a cost that discounts the value of rewards, pressure drives you to value effort and seek it, such that more effort is more valuable and therefore you're more likely to choose it. So completely breaking lesson one that I told you about before. Anyway, so we tested that in a series of experiments where people had to choose between more effort that made more progress towards a goal or less effort that made less progress towards a goal, but was easier. And what we found is that the strongest predictor of people's choices is always this deadline pressure. So that is how much work you've got to complete divided by how long you've got to complete it. And we've shown through using fMRI once again that the anterior cingulate cortex, Andy, the anterior cingulate cortex is the region that seems important for both processing how much pressure you feel when you're making decisions about whether to exert effort or not, and also in this red area, which adjacent to it, processes an update to how much pressure you feel when you see the outcomes of the efforts you've exerted. And so that all fits with this idea that deadlines cause this pressure that switches you to value and seek higher effort, rather than treating it as a cost. Okay, lesson 7. Are we motivated like other species? I want to thank 3 of my PhD students for getting really interested in this question, because this is something that had always fascinated me. And Campbell Lahiron, Emma Scully, and Seb were my 3 PhD students who got really interested in this idea that actually how we motivate behaviors and the decisions we make about exerting effort or decisions we make about reward might actually be linked to the kind of mechanisms that happen in much, much simpler species that have been conserved in us. So if you imagine a bee when it is collecting pollen, it needs to make decisions about how much reward it's getting right now and how much effort it might be to travel to get to the next flower. And so they got really interested in this idea of, rather than turning to psychological literature, can we actually look at the behavioral ecology literature? Can we look at how animals forage for food and apply some of those principles to better understand human motivation and human decision making? And so that has inspired a line of work where what we try and do is create experiments that are testing principles from behavioral ecology about how animals make foraging-based decisions, and then applying that to humans. Now, I gave Campbell some license to his first experiment to come up with his own ideas, and he decided to come up with the milk gathering or milk farming game, where he designed an experiment based around how animals actually, based around how farmers might collect milk from different cows in different fields. I would say that Campbell grew up in rural New Zealand, and there is a video somewhere that he won't show me of him milking a cow on TV in New Zealand when he was 5 years old. I think that's the inspiration here. I won't go into all of the details, but what we've shown is that if you manipulate dopamine levels, it actually changes something about how people process the environment they're in. And this is what makes it linked to the ecological literature. That it's not just about the decision that's right in front of you, it's about the wider environment you're in and how you adapt to it. And in slightly more preliminary work, Emma has shown that actually if you think about taking ideas from behavioral ecology, like such as how humans make decisions when they're in a mountainous region versus in a very flat region. You might apply some of those same principles and design an experiment where people have to make decisions based on how they might be foraging, based on effort rather than reward. And she's shown that this other region of the anterior cingulate cortex is linked to how people process how effortful the environment they're in, basically how mountainous is it, and how this changes their decisions. So finally to lesson 8, and I'm going to preface this lesson and the picture I use next with one thing, which is a couple of years ago I got married and my brother very kindly stepped in to be my best man. And he gave a speech about me that was described by several people in the audience as brutal. So he also seems that he has now decided he's not even going to marry his partner because he's so afraid of the consequences of the speech that I might give. But today's my platform. So this is me and my brother. And I want to illustrate this next lesson that is people are motivated to different levels, using my brother as an example. So when we were children, and as I mentioned before, we both loved football, but I was really motivated when I played football. I would run for hours. My brother, on the other hand, used to stand in the left back position, twiddling his hair and standing still. So people can be different in their levels of motivation. And this is something that we want to really push forward in our research now, is to better understand why people differ so much. And this might be crucial in particular for understanding disorders of motivation, such as clinical laziness like my brother, or really motivated people like me. And so over the last few years, we've really been expanding this line of research to really ask a whole range of different questions about how we can translate these ideas about effort-based decision-making to better understand variability between people, differences between different populations. And for instance, we've been looking at how the motivation to exert effort might change across the lifespan. So how older adults might process motivation and effort differently from younger adults. We've been looking at how this all relates to levels of physical activity in daily life. So can these experiments tell us about people who might struggle with being motivated in order to engage in physical activity and therefore get the health benefits? We've been recently starting to look at how these deadlines and how deadlines shape motivation could be really useful to better understanding how adolescents motivate themselves towards meeting deadlines and how that might change as we get older. And through a Wellcome Trust grant with Masood Hussain, Kath Harmer, and Simon Little, we're really starting to try and translate all of these ideas. So we're trying to do it transdiagnostically to look across the healthy population. How does motivation and effort link to all of these different psychological traits and symptoms? We're trying to look at how different medications might influence people's willingness to put in effort and how that might link to symptoms and syndromes such as apathy and anhedonia. And then we're trying to look at that in clinical disorders, so a range of different neurological conditions. So those are my 8 lessons about effort. So the take-home story is, if you aren't motivated, it's not your fault. It's your cingulate cortex, the most important brain region. And it's about dopamine. So what we've learned is that actually this anterior cingulate cortex, what we've learned over the years is this anterior cingulate cortex region isn't one brain area. There are multiple different subregions. When we think of them as a whole, it seems like they're all important for motivating us to put in effort. But they each seem to perform slightly different computations that impact on how willing we are to put in effort into different types of behavior. And so I think by taking this kind of approach of bringing together the equations that govern how we make decisions, combining that with psychopharmacology, theories from behavioral ecology, and looking at how we can translate all of these ideas is how we might better understand why you can't be bothered. So that's the kind of end of the scientific part of my talk. But I, of course, need to thank the many people who've been involved in my career at a variety of different stages for all of the support and everything I've learned from them. I wanted to try and put some slides up with people's names listed, but I knew that what would happen is I'd miss out some really key people and then feel awful about it. So what I really just want to say is everybody who's been in my lab, who's been supervised by me at any point, I'm so grateful for all of the work that you have done. You have brought so much insight, so much enthusiasm, so much lacking of apathy, so much effort over the years. It's been fascinating to work with all of you. And we've also, had quite a bit of fun along the way. They're all super grateful for that picture, I can see. I want to thank everybody here in Birmingham, particularly all of my colleagues in the CHBH. Bill's right when I said, I love it here. I really do think this is a fantastic place to work. We have such a great environment for doing both high quality research, but also for supporting each other. And I really value being a part of this centre. Everybody always thanks their funders, and I want to thank my funders, but I particularly want to thank the BBSRC and these particular individuals. I was stupidly lucky in order to have 2 back-to-back BBSRC fellowships, something that's not even possible now. And what I can say is that really gave me the support that allowed me to develop my lab into something much bigger, doing much more ambitious and exciting research than would have been possible without it. And so I want to thank all of these people who are part of the BBSRC office, even in the blue shirts, David McAllister. I hope he's online. Even him who said that they were stupid to give me back-to-back fellowships. I think he was joking. I want to thank all of the people who've mentored me, particularly Narendra, Manos, and Masood. I've learned so much from them. I learned so much from Narendra about how to design good experiments and how beautiful understanding brain anatomy can be. I learned so much from Manos about, well, I'm not going to say I can be as sexy a lecturer as he is, but I learned so much from Manos about how to present your research and about how to understand the integration between different disciplines. And I learned so much from Masood about how to write a good grant. Unfortunately, I never learned from Masood how to dance. I have to, of course, thank all of my family who, for all of their support over the years. I obviously wouldn't be here without all of you. And particularly want to introduce my 2 new nephews, Nathaniel and Alexander, who've been an absolute bright light in everybody's lives over the last year. Now, I think there's probably one person that you're thinking I haven't really mentioned enough today and said enough thanks to. And that, of course, is someone who's brought me so much joy and so much wonder over the years. And that is Softmax. You can, of course, follow him on Instagram. She's smiling, it's okay. No, but there is one person that has been such a huge part of my life. And that, sorry. So Patricia, we've traveled the world together. We've laughed together. We've got really grumpy when systems don't work together. And we've published 31 papers as co-authors, which is ridiculous. And now we're going to go on this amazing journey in the next 3 weeks, assuming you haven't gone into labor already, as we introduce a 4th member to our family. And I love you so much and so grateful for everything you've done for me. And thank you all for being bothered.